This podfic contains content that may be disturbing for some viewers, including mentions of violence, guns, and physical and emotional abuse. Please check out the complete list of content warnings in the description, and proceed with caution if you are sensitive to these topics.
Hello my lovely little gemstones, it's Afira, and today I'll be reading When the Chips Are Down by Whiskey with Patron. Chapter 21. I really should not have flirted with a stranger. Patton stared out the window of the car as Thomas drove. They'd already stopped by Thomas's place to pick up Remy's bike, and he was driving right in front of them with Andy on the back of the bike. Price sat in the front seat of the car next to Thomas. They'd opted to keep Patton in the back since it was harder to see him through the back windows, and anyone chasing them was looking for him, so keeping him hidden was their priority. At least, that was the explanation Patton had come up with. In reality, they told him to stay in the back because he could see both sides of the road that way and shoot at anyone following them. That reasoning made a knot of bad feelings form in his stomach, so he told himself it was the best place to stay hidden in order to help him feel better. Still, he kept Remy's pistol in his hands and his head on a swivel, trying to spot anyone in the surrounding traffic who might be tailing them. So far, he hadn't seen anyone suspicious, but he couldn't be too cautious. Andy was directing them across the city to a hotel she'd found that seemed safe enough. Patton still wondered if going to the Critic House would be safer, but he trusted everyone else's judgment. If they thought hiding out somewhere else was a better idea, he would believe them. Remy and Andy eventually led them to a parking lot of a small hotel. It looked a little run down, but the lesser known it was, the less likely any of Rath's agents would come looking for him here. By Patton's standards, it was perfect. Thomas parked the car and they all clambered out of the vehicle. Remy and Andy hopped off the bike, removing their helmets. Patton was tempted to try again to give Remy's gun back, but he knew that after his little display of marksmanship earlier, Remy would probably never take it back. "This place looks like a shithole," Price muttered. "I didn't even bring any extra clothes to stay the night. You guys just whisked me away with you without warning me I should be spending the night with you losers." "Give it a rest, Princey," Andy said. She shouldered her laptop bag. "It's not like I have much either." "I packed some of your stuff in my bag," Thomas said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Don't worry." Andy put a hand to her chest and stared at him with wide eyes. "Bro, you were thinking of me?" Thomas put a hand on her shoulder. "Bro, I also brought your extra laptop charger." Andy stared at him with a mixture of gratitude and affection. "Bro," Thomas nodded in response. "Bro." Price rolled her eyes. "Oh my god, shut up! Let's just go get our room already." She trudged across the parking lot to the doors. Thomas and Patton exchanged an uncertain glance before following after her. Maybe it would have been best to leave her behind. She clearly didn't want to be here any more than the rest of them wanted her there. However, she admitted it earlier herself. She would give them up for the bounty money if she had the chance. They had to keep an eye on her. Remy linked his arm with Patton's. "Well, babe, no use waiting around. Let's go." They all made their way across the parking lot together and entered the building. They hurried to catch up with Price. Inside the hotel wasn't too fancy. There was just a general reception area, with some couches set against the wall. A few potted plants were placed around the room as decoration. They all stopped at the front desk. Remy shouldered his way to the front of the group to speak with the receptionist. "Hate to bother you, hon, but do you have any rooms available?" The receptionist behind the counter looked up. His gaze flickered to Patton, then to Remy. His eyes widened and traveled down Remy's body, and back up again. Yes, we should. Let me check for a moment." He turned to his computer, shooting a couple sideways glances at Remy and smiling. Patton was used to seeing people react this way to Remy. He could probably flirt his way out of anything. "We have a few empty rooms," the man said. He looked up at Remy with a flirtatious grin. "Is there a specific room on a specific floor you were looking for?" "If you've got any on the bottom floor, we'll take that one." Smirking, Remy lowered his sunglasses to look at him. "I mean, if that's all right with you." "It sure is." The receptionist dug around in his desk and brought out 2 key cards. "If you like, I can show you to your room." Remy leaned against the counter. "How about you tell my friends which room it is so they can get settled, and you and I can work out the payment details." The man's cheeks flushed red. "That works for me." He handed Remy the key cards. "It's room 134. Remy held the key cards out to Patton without taking his eyes off the receptionist. Patton resisted the urge to roll his eyes at Remy and took the cards. He handed 1 card to Andy. The 4 of them made their way to the door that led to a hallway of rooms, leaving Remy to his flirting. Patton scanned the door numbers as they passed. Despite the fact that he didn't like having a gun on him, part of him was grateful for it. He kept one hand in his pocket, holding the gun with his finger on the trigger. He hadn't even turned the safety on, but his finger was steady. He'd never misfired a gun in his life. He wasn't going to break that habit now. They reached the room and Andy opened the door. Patton peered inside before they entered, just on the off chance that someone was waiting for them inside. There appeared to be no one in the room, so they all walked in and dumped their bags on the floor. "All right, who's taking the beds and who's sleeping on the floor?" Price scoffed. "You think I would sleep on the floor?" "Well, I don't want to sleep on the floor," Andy said, glaring at Price. "I'll take the floor," Patton offered. Thomas shook his head. "No, I'll take it. I don't really like sleeping with strangers. Not that I do that a lot. And it's not like we would be..." His face turned red with embarrassment. He picked up his bag and walked further into the room. "You and Remy can have the bed." Andy and Price both stared at him. "I have to share a bed with her?" they said at the same time, pointing at each other. Patton dragged his backpack over to the bed closest to the door and tossed it onto the mattress. He had a feeling their brief stay at this hotel was going to feel very, very long. Remy gave the receptionist his best winning smirk. "I think that's it for the payment." The receptionist, who Remy had learned was named James, nodded and rolled his chair away from his computer, having finished registering Remy and the others in the room they had taken. "I suppose so," he said, an equally flirtatious grin on his lips. He glanced down at his watch. "Although, it is almost time for my lunch break. I can get someone else behind the desk, and maybe you and I can go get something to drink at the hotel bar." Remy and the receptionist had been talking for over an hour, maybe even longer. It hadn't actually taken that long to get the payment method sorted out, but he figured the more he flirted, the more willing this guy would be to cover up any suspicious or illegal actions he saw Remy and the rest of his little group participating in. If not that, he could maybe at least convince him to give them free room for a night. "That sounds good to me," Remy said. James stood. "I'll text one of my coworkers. Give me a moment." Remy waited patiently as James fired off a text to ask someone else to take over as receptionist. He stood up and walked around to the front of the desk where Remy was waiting. "Follow me." Remy trailed after him. The thought crossed his mind that he should probably be getting back to Patton and the others, but he was sure they'd be fine on their own. James led him across the lobby to a door. He pushed it open and they entered a well-lit lounge room. A cluster of couches sat at the far corner of the room, with a coffee table in the middle of them. A bar stood off to the left wall, with a line of stools around it. A few other people were scattered around the room, but Remy figured the bar wouldn't be more active until much later at night. James led him over to the bar. "We get an employee discount on drinks," he said with a coy smile. "Anything you want, I'll cover it." "Well, aren't you considerate?" Remy said. He sat down at the bar and James lowered himself into the seat next to him. James shrugged. "It's part of my charm." He looked up at the bartender and held up 2 fingers. The bartender turned and started mixing drinks. Remy studied James's face as the bartender worked. He really was cute, just not Remy's type. But hey, there was nothing wrong with a little harmless flirting. Besides, it couldn't hurt to stay on good terms with this guy. He definitely needed more connections in different cities. He never knew who could be useful in this line of work. James rested his elbow on the bar and his chin on his hand, gaze fixed on Remy's face. "So, what are you and your friends doing here?" "Just looking for a place to stay the night," he answered. "We're going on a road trip." "Sounds fun. Are you headed anywhere specific?" "Not really. Just wandering. We want to see the country." "Oh, I'd love to go on a road trip," James sighed wistfully. "But I've never left Side Hill much. I mean, I've left a couple times to go over to Clawmore, but other than that, I don't get around much." He cocked his head. "Where are you guys from?" "At Clawmore, actually," Remy said. "I have a friend who lives there, so we figured we'd stop here first and see where the road takes us." James smirked. "Well, they sure are lucky if they get to spend hours being stuck in a vehicle with you." Remy's eyebrows shot up. This guy was kind of smooth. The bartender placed a couple glasses in front of them. "Enjoy," he said, before turning away and grabbing a cloth to wipe down the counter. James stirred his drink with his finger. "So, just out of curiosity, what do you do for work?" Remy had lifted his drink to his lips, but he paused. He couldn't exactly tell this man that he ran illegal odd jobs for a variety of small gangs in the underground crime world. He needed to think of something to say, quick. "Motorcycle mechanic," he blurted. "I'm a freelancer." "A freelancer, huh? So you don't have to take all the jobs you get. You can just take breaks whenever?" "Yeah, pretty much." Remy sipped at his drink. Must have been whiskey. It burned his throat a little. "Sounds fun," James said. "I've always wanted to be a freelance worker. Being stuck as a hotel receptionist just isn't doing it for me." "I understand. It must be hard being stuck behind a desk all day." "Yeah, but it brings in money, so..." he shrugged. Who am I to complain? Remy nodded, taking another gulp from his glass. Fair enough, he set his drink down. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? You know, you got any family? A partner? James grinned. If you're asking me whether I'm single, the answer is yes. But hopefully I can find someone that will change that answer. What about you? Remy shrugged as he drank a little more. He was single too, but he did hop from person to person a lot. He just didn't have time for a relationship. Most of his time was spent either working or hanging out with Patton. Yeah, I'm single, he said. I just haven't found the time for a relationship yet. I've been too busy. I understand. It can be hard to juggle relationships with the rest of your life. James tapped his fingers on the side of his glass. If I ever got a boyfriend, I don't know how I'd be able to spend any time with him. My career is my entire life. Remy took another sip of his drink. He went to set it down, but he fumbled with the mostly empty glass and almost dropped it. The room seemed to spin around him. He shook his head vigorously to recenter his senses. What the hell just happened? Are you okay? James asked. It took a moment for Remy to process his words. Yeah, I'm fine, he muttered. He felt a lot more drunk than he should have. He only had one drink, and there was hardly any alcohol in it. In fairness, it had been a while since he last drank alcohol, so maybe it was just hitting him a little hard. He tried to sit up straight, but his world turned upside down, and he almost toppled out of the chair. Jesus, what was in that drink? He felt James' hands on his shoulders, trying to hold him upright. You okay, bud? The bartender's voice asked. Remy, are you all right? James asked. Remy wanted to answer, but a wave of nausea washed over him, and he gripped the edge of the bar to keep himself from falling over. He squeezed his eyes shut as his stomach turned. I think it worked, James's voice said. It carried none of the flirtatious tone it had before. Let's get him to a room and send a call to his friends. Got it, the bartender's voice said. Remy felt James's arms wrap around him and ease him onto his feet. We'll get you to a room so you can lay down, he said softly. Your friends will come get you. Don't worry about a thing. Remy wobbled on his feet as he stumbled along, barely able to walk. James guided him to the door, and one thing crossed his mind before all coherent thoughts completely abandoned him. The bartender fucking drugged him. Well, shit. Price groaned as she flipped through the TV channels. There is literally nothing to watch. Do they not have Netflix? Most hotels don't, Princey, Andy said. She'd brought out her laptop and was slouched in her seat on the bed that she was unwillingly sharing with Price. That's stupid, Price grumbled. She settled on a cooking show and tossed the remote to the side. Thomas flipped through a hotel brochure and leaned against Patton's bed. He'd sat himself on the floor, despite Patton's insistence that he could sit on the bed if he wanted to. Do you guys want to get room service? I'm kind of hungry. Order some pizza. Yeah, pizza sounds good right about now. Andy stared wide-eyed at her. You're agreeing with me? I would have thought you'd hate pizza. Price scoffed. Oh, honey, come on. You'd have to be crazy to hate pizza. Thomas glanced up at Patton. You up for food? Patton just shrugged. He hadn't said much since they got into the room. He was too busy thinking about that car chase. He fiddled with the gun Remy had given him, sliding the magazine in and out of the chamber. He wished Remy would stop flirting with that receptionist and come to the room already. Patton didn't feel at ease when Remy was out of sight. The guy could get attacked and Patton would never know. The phone on the nightstand rang. Patton jumped at the sound, but he set the gun aside and reached for the phone. He picked it up and held it to his ear. Hello? Is this the room under the name Remy Dormier? Asked a voice. Patton hesitated. This felt like a trap. Yes, he said finally. Who am I speaking to? Patton bit his lip. This was definitely a trap. What do you want? He said instead. He wasn't telling his name to anyone, not when there was a bounty on his head. We want Patton Hart. Patton's blood ran cold. Where's Remy? He demanded. The other three looked up at him, concerned by his tone of voice. He's unharmed, the voice said, but he won't be that way for long if you don't give us Patton. Where are you? Second floor, room 245. If you call the police or take any longer than 10 minutes to get here, your friend starts losing some of his fingers. I'll be there as soon as I can. Patton hung up and shot to his feet. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Remy, no matter what. If that meant giving himself up to wrath, so be it. What's going on? Andy asked. Someone has Remy. Patton grabbed the gun and slammed the magazine in. I'm going to get him back. Thomas scrambled to his feet. Well, I'm coming with you. Andy shut her laptop. So am I. No, you're not, Patton said. He let the slide of the gun shoot forward, loading around into the chamber. I don't know how many people are involved. It's safest for me to give myself up. Price stood. You're giving yourself up to save him? Why didn't I think of kidnapping anyone to get you?
Not the time, Princey, Andy said.
Well, I'm gonna come with you, Price said, loading her own gun. If anyone's getting your bounty money, it's going to be me. I'm not letting someone else get you.
No, you and Andy are staying here, Thomas insisted. We don't want things to get too out of hand. Andy, connect to my phone and I'll keep you on the line while we're there. Make sure Price doesn't do anything dumb. Andy's shoulders slumped. Fine. Probably better I stay here anyway. I can't fight worse shit. Patton grabbed his bag off the floor and dug around in its contents. He took out a gun of his own and shoved it in his pocket. Let's go get Remy back. Chapter 22. My hot friend was kidnapped. Patton kept his gun loaded as he hurried to the elevator. His trigger finger twitched every so often, but never enough to actually misfire. Neither Patton nor Thomas spoke as Patton hit the button for the elevator. His mind raced with thoughts, each one worse than the last. What if the people who had Remy already hurt him? What if they were in the process of killing him right now? They could be threatening him, beating him up, doing horrible, unspeakable things to him. Patton's thoughts were interrupted when the door opened. He stepped into the elevator, Thomas right behind him. He didn't know why Thomas insisted on coming with him, but Patton was actually glad for the company. A plan had already begun forming in Patton's mind, and he'd need Thomas to get Remy out of the room before he went through with it. He needed Remy to be safe first. He pressed the button for the second floor and waited as the elevator rose. He tapped his foot impatiently. The elevator stopped and the doors opened. Patton stepped out and immediately started down a hallway, scanning the door numbers for the one Remy was in. Which room did they say they were in? Thomas asked. He held his own gun in his hands, and Patton was glad for the extra backup. 245, Patton answered. Patton spotted the door he was looking for. His heart raced as his instincts kicked in, readying him for a fight the second someone opened that door. His left index finger twitched. Patton took a deep breath and knocked on the door. There was the sound of someone shuffling behind the door and talking to someone else. Who is it? A voice asked. Patton Hart, Patton answered flatly. God, if they did anything at all to Remy, Patton was going to frickin' lose it. Are you alone? Patton hesitated. No, he wouldn't let me come here without him. He heard more hushed conversation from within the room. Footsteps walked to the door, and it opened a crack. A man peered out at them. Both of you, in here, he said. He opened the door the rest of the way. Thomas shot Patton a worried glance, but they filed into the room. Inside was a normal hotel room with 2 beds and a bathroom off to the left. The guy who'd let them in raised a gun and pointed it at Patton's head before Patton even knew what was happening. Hand over your weapons. Thomas hesitated, but Patton held his gun out to the man, who took it in his free hand. Thomas handed over his own weapon with a defeated sigh. Where's Remy? Patton asked. The man nodded towards the beds and stepped aside. Patton and Thomas brushed past him and walked further into the room. The receptionist from earlier sat in the spinny chair at the desk, idly scrolling through his phone. Patton's heart pounded faster when he saw Remy's body tossed haphazardly onto one of the beds. His hands were bound together in front of him, and a cloth was tied over his mouth. His sunglasses were hooked on the collar of his shirt, revealing half-closed eyes that were glazed over and blank. They brightened a little when his gaze slid over Patton. He made a frustrated whining sound in his throat and struggled against his bonds. Patton had to try really hard to resist the urge to punch the receptionist in the face. What did you do to him? He's fine, the receptionist said, waving a hand dismissively. The name tag on his shirt read James. Just a little drugged. With what? James looked over at the other man. What did you put in his drink? The man shrugged. The name tag on his uniform said Darren. Just a little GHB. He'll be fine in a few hours. Patton mentally cursed. Of course Remy hadn't known he was being drugged. If these people had accidentally doomed Remy by overdosing him, Patton would throttle them himself with his bare hands. Well, I'm here now, Patton said. Let him go. James narrowed his eyes and set his phone down. How do I know you're not planning something? They gave me their weapons, Darren said. They haven't done shit yet. Pretty sure they're fine. James glared at him. Fine. He stood and walked to Remy. He pointed at Thomas and snapped his fingers. You get this bitch out of here. We're taking Hart. Thomas looked from Patton to James to Darren. You're kidding, right? Patton, I thought we were going to fight them. I thought that was the plan. The plan was to get Remy to safety, Patton pointed out. I even said I was going to give myself up. You didn't listen. I thought you were kidding. Darren spread his hands. Look, if you don't want him, I can always just shoot him. Thomas, Patton said, voice firm, get Remy out of here. Thomas frantically glanced from Patton to Remy. Patton gave him his best stern dad look, the one that said, you'd better do this or you're grounded. Patton rarely ever used that face, but it felt necessary to use it now.
Thomas deflated when he realized Patton wasn't going to be leaving the room with him and Remy. He tore his gaze away from Patton and walked to the bed where Remy was laying. Remy grunted unhappily as Thomas helped him into an upright position. Remy squirmed and tried to wriggle out of Thomas's grasp, but Thomas managed to lift Remy into his arms. Remy mumbled something through the gag over his mouth. His gaze was fixed on Patton, and he reached out with his tied hands as if he could grab Patton from across the room. Darren trailed the two with his gun as Thomas carried Remy to the door. Remy whined in distress and weakly kicked his feet, trying to reach over Thomas's shoulder to grab at Patton, but Thomas didn't let go. He shot Patton a disappointed look and left the room, kicking the door shut behind him. Darren moved the gun from Thomas as soon as he and Remy were out of sight. Now to deal with you. Patton tried to calm his beating heart as Darren leveled his gun at Patton's head. James crossed his arms and leaned against the desk. "Should we knock you out, or are you going to come quietly?" "I'll go with you," Patton said. His mind raced, taking in all the threats of the room. Something shiny poked out of James's pocket. A knife, maybe. Darren had his own gun along with Patton and Thomas's. James was poised on the balls of his feet despite his relaxed stance, ready to strike if Patton so much as moved an inch. He sensed Darren shifting his weight behind Patton. "All right, we're going to take you outside." Patton felt the cold muzzle of the gun press against the back of his head. He grimaced at the feeling. He jabbed his elbow backwards, hitting Darren square in the nose. Darren cried out and stumbled back. Rapid footsteps hit the floor as James lunged for him. He whirled around and grabbed the wrist of the hand that held James's knife, which was inches away from stabbing him in the neck. He kneed James in the stomach and he doubled over, disoriented. Patton snatched up the knife and shoved him to the ground. He heard the click of a gun cocking and spun around, jabbing out with the knife. It stuck in Darren's stomach. He dropped his gun, mouth open in an O of surprise. Patton grabbed one of the guns Darren dropped and found its grip familiar. It was Remy's. Patton flicked the safety off. He fired off a round already cocked in the chamber as a warning shot before sliding another round into the gun. James stared wide-eyed at the bullet hole in the wall next to his head. He slowly looked back at Patton. "I don't miss twice," Patton warned. "Stay where you are." James shot a wary glance at his knife, which was still clutched in Patton's right hand with a veil of blood on the blade. He turned his gaze to the bleeding wound in Darren's torso. "He'll be fine. It wasn't fatal," Patton said. "If I wanted to kill him, he'd be dead." "What the fuck was that?" James breathed. I thought you... "You thought wrong." Patton's trigger finger twitched. "I don't want you coming after us again. Got it?" James narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "How are you going to keep us away?" Patton answered his question with another question. "How long have you been in this business?" James seemed confused. "About 12 years. Why?" "Recognize the name Poison Dart?" James furrowed his brow. "Yeah, why?" His eyes widened. "Wait a damn minute," he scoffed. "Are you seriously implying that you're him? Are you kidding? Wrath went after him. He's dead. A body was never found. You think Poison Dart wouldn't be able to run from Wrath? Why do you think I'm so high up on their shit list now? Besides, do you really want to take that chance?" James swallowed. His gaze flickered to the bullet hole in the wall. He lightly shook his head. Patton lowered the gun and turned to the door. He stepped over Darren's bleeding form and tossed the knife to the floor. He leaned down and scooped up Thomas's gun. He was about to leave the room, but he paused at the door. "James?" "Yeah?" His voice shook. "You're letting us stay here for the night, free of charge. And if anyone asks about the gunshot, tell them someone broke in or something. I don't care. Just make it believable. And don't let this get out to anyone else." "Sure thing." Patton left the room and shut the door. Thomas stood outside in the hallway, Remy in his arms, staring at Patton with wide eyes and a mouth hanging open in shock. "Poison Dart, huh?" he whispered. "You're not kidding, are you?" Patton shoved his gun in his pocket. He didn't feel good about what just happened, but at least he'd gotten everyone out of there safely. "I'm not kidding," he sighed. "Wrath's blade told everyone you died. Well, excuse my strong language, but Wrath can frick right off. That's not strong language." Remy interrupted the conversation with another upset whine. He made grabby hands at Patton, kicking his legs. Patton reached out to undo Remy's bonds, but Remy captured Patton's hand in both of his. "No, I'm not holding your hand, Rem. I'm trying to untie you." Patton managed to get the thin cord untied so Remy can freely move his arms. Remy latched onto Patton's sleeve with one hand, while Patton lifted the gag off of Remy's face with the arm that wasn't trapped in Remy's grasp. Remy mumbled something incoherent as soon as the cloth was off his face. Patton leaned in to hear him better. "What was that?" "Don't feel good," Remy muttered. "Yeah, GHB will do that to you." Patton held out his arms, inviting Thomas to deposit Remy onto him.
You'll feel better in a few hours. Thomas carefully shifted Remy's weight and set him in Patton's arms. Remy clung to Patton's cat hoodie with both hands. He groaned as if he had a pounding headache. Thomas plucked his gun from Patton's hand as Remy settled into Patton's arms. Thomas looked Patton dead in the eye. "Your poison dart." Patton wasn't proud of it, but he nodded. Thomas furrowed his brow. "You're not gonna kill any of us while we're sleeping, are you?"
"Heavens, no!" Patton blurted, horrified by the suggestion. "You and Andy have been so nice. You took us in and you got us food and you're on the run with us. Of course I wouldn't hurt you, kiddo. You can count on that." A tiny smile of relief spread across Thomas's face. "Call me crazy, but I believe you. We should probably get him back to the room." "Yeah." Patton hefted Remy in his arms. Remy groaned at the movement and buried his face in Patton's shoulder. Everyone was more or less silent as they made their way back to the bottom floor. Andy had no idea what to think. As soon as she heard something about poison dart through the speaker of Thomas's phone, she was confused. She didn't know what that meant. If it was related to some old gang or organization from years and years ago, Andy would have no clue what it was. She was only 23. She'd been in the business for maybe 4 years. And Price was no help either. Andy had asked her, but all she'd gotten in response was, "I'm hardly older than you, Hot Topic. You think I know anything about this?" Now all of them were in the hotel room, and Andy and Price couldn't discuss the issue further without looking suspicious. Thomas seemed to have forgotten that Andy was still connected to his phone. Andy wanted nothing more than to sit Thomas down and question him about it, but they had more issues on their plate right now. As soon as Patton and Thomas returned to the room, Remy squirmed out of Patton's arms, almost falling right on his face in the process. He mumbled something about feeling nauseous and stumbled off to the bathroom, a concerned Patton in tow. Andy set her laptop aside and hurried after them to help with Remy. She didn't want Patton to do all the work. Minutes later, Remy was dry heaving into the toilet, having already emptied his guts of everything he'd eaten earlier. They'd managed to get Remy's leather jacket off. His white shirt was spotted with sweat, and Andy left the bathroom to find a new one while Patton stayed with Remy in the bathroom. Price and Thomas looked up from the TV screen as Andy began to dig through Remy's stuff. "Is he okay?" "Yeah. Still heaving, though." Andy tossed Remy's motorcycle keys aside. "What was he drugged with?" "GHB, Thomas answered. He rolled up his sleeve and scratched at the snake tattoo in his forearm. "He'll be fine in a few hours, I think." He stood up from his seat on the bed. "I'm gonna go out and get us some pizza. Don't die or anything while I'm gone." He grabbed his car keys off the nightstand and walked to the door. Andy huffed in frustration and straightened from where she was crouched over Remy's bags. Did this bitch not bring any extra clothes? "Beats me," Price mumbled. She was flicking through the TV channels, searching for something to watch. Andy heaved a sigh and turned to Patton's backpack. Surely the guy wouldn't mind if his friend borrowed one of his shirts for a while. As an afterthought, she grabbed a water bottle from the bag. Remy would need something to drink to get the taste of vomit out of his mouth. Andy entered the bathroom again, one of Patton's shirts draped over her arm. "He didn't have any shirts, so I grabbed one of yours. Is that okay?" "That's just fine, kiddo," Patton said. He gently rubbed Remy's back as Remy retched into the toilet. "Gosh, he doesn't look good." "Yeah, no shit." Andy set the water bottle next to the toilet so Remy could grab it when he wanted. "I'm gonna go scan the area," she said, handing the shirt off to Patton. "Okay, I'll stay here." Andy waved goodbye with a 2-fingered salute and left the bathroom. She was planning on scanning the area at some point, sure, but more than that, she wanted to know what this poison dart thing was about. She sat on the bed next to Price and grabbed her laptop. As soon as she unlocked it, she disconnected from Thomas's phone, hoping Thomas wouldn't remember that she'd been connected at all in the first place. She trusted Thomas, sure, but this just felt like something she couldn't talk to him about. She got the feeling he wouldn't even talk about it if she asked. She opened up her browser and went to the hacker forum page she frequented. It was a good place to get information from multiple sources, and if she had questions, someone would probably answer them. Andy scrolled to the forum search bar and typed in poison dart. There weren't many results. This forum page was only about 7 years old to her knowledge, and if this poison dart thing was older, it was no wonder there were hardly any results. She found a post from 5 years ago titled, "Anyone remember poison dart?" She clicked on it and skimmed the post. "I've only been in the scene for about a year, and I'm really confused. Who's this poison dart guy I keep hearing about? I'm with Raspblade, by the way, and I keep hearing older people talking about them, but no one will tell me who they are." Andy scrolled down to the replies. Oddly enough, there was a copious amount of people who had replied to this post. And don't worry about him, he's dead. Fucking good thing, too. The guy killed my sister and half of the Vine 39ers back in 2008. That gang's fallen off the earth now because of him. Oh, dude, he slaughtered a shit ton of Chimera agents in 2010 way out in Clawmore. Picani still talks about it sometimes. I think he was there. The guy was a phenomenal assassin. I always wanted to be like him, you know, until he set the Glassed Heart's home base on fire and stalked me and my work partner through the Critic House just to kill her. Once that fucker has his eyes on someone, that bitch is not getting out alive. Low-key wish I could have gotten some pointers from him, though. Bruh, I'm a newbie at Wrath, too. Stationed out in San Fran. Apparently this guy was mostly seen around Florida, but there's a handful of older agents out here who talk about him, too. Last time anyone saw him here was 2006. Guy stabbed a Chimera agent out in broad daylight and disappeared without a damn trace. Why is no one else talking about what he did to the Storytime gang back in 2004? That shit got him on the map as a respected assassin. It's nowhere near as bad as the Chimera Massacre of 2010, but it was impressive for a guy who had only been in the business for a few years. He was only in his early 20s back then, I think. Andy looked away from her screen and leaned back in her seat, processing this information. Were these people seriously talking about Patton Hart? The sweet little puffball who was comforting his sick friend in the bathroom? The loving father who had left his kids behind for their own safety? Could this possibly be the same person? Andy felt someone lean over her shoulder. "Holy shit," said a voice. Andy nearly jumped out of her skin. "Jesus fuck, Princey, warn a dude next time." Price ignored Andy's startled outburst and peered at the screen. "I've heard about a few of those incidents," she said. "I wasn't there for any of them, but that thing with the Glassed Hearts gang was like an old horror movie. I've seen what their old base is like now. No one bothered to fix it up. I think all the remaining members picked up and moved to Clawmore." "Their old base is in this city?" Andy asked. "Yep." Price's eyes widened. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking? If you're thinking we should sneak away later and investigate the Glassed Heart's old base to see if we can find any information on Patton and this poison dart thing, then yes. Yes, I am." Andy furrowed her brow. "But I don't think I trust you enough to take you out anywhere." "Girl, I'm here to take in Deadshot over there, not you. You don't have a bounty on your head. Besides, I don't want to take him in until I figure out what all this is." She gestured to Andy's computer screen. "This is the most interesting thing I've heard about in years." Andy hesitated. She couldn't trust Price, but she desperately wanted to know more about Poison Dart and Patton. "Maybe we can go tomorrow," Andy suggested. She closed the browser and shut her laptop. Chapter 23. Today was not as shitty as yesterday. Supper had gone a lot better than Virgil had thought it would. He kept expecting Mr. Chimera to say that it was weird they were having pancakes for supper, but he hardly said a word the entire meal. He had thanked Virgil when he was done and left the room to take his dishes to the kitchen. Virgil's anxiety kept insisting that Virgil had done something to make Mr. Chimera mad, but he just took a deep breath and tried to remind himself that everything had gone well earlier. There was no reason for Mr. Chimera to be upset with him. The twins finished their food and immediately ran off to the living room to play. Mr. Minder hurried after them to keep them from destroying anything, which was a good decision. The two of them were a destructive force when left unsupervised. DW started gathering the plates off the table, and Virgil stood up to help. She looked a bit surprised by this, but she didn't say anything about it. She just gave him a grateful smile. "I'll go help Jan with the dishes," she said. She held out a hand to take the plates from Virgil. Virgil hesitated. "I can help if you want." DW raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to help? Do you want my help?" DW smiled. "You're just as indecisive as Janus." She held out her plates and Virgil piled them on top of the ones in his arms. "Go help Jan. I need to go clean the pool anyway." Virgil turned and walked across the hall to the kitchen, balancing the plates in his arms. His stomach turned with anxiety at the thought of being stuck in the kitchen alone with this person he hardly knew again, but he pushed that bad feeling down. He was fine. Mr. Chimera wasn't going to hurt him or anything. Nothing had gone wrong when they were cooking together earlier. Virgil nudged the kitchen door open and was taken by surprise when the sound of music hit his ears. The tunes of a chill, jazzy song with a nice piano and string instrumentals swam through the air. It wasn't his taste, but he didn't dislike it. A phone with a bright yellow case sat on the island, the source of the music. Mr. Chimera stood at the far wall over the sink. The faucet was on, filling the sink with water. Janus sorted the dishes along the counter and sang quietly along with the song playing from his phone as he waited for the sink to fill up. Virgil walked up to where the dishes were piled and set the plates on the counter. Janus caught sight of him and paused in his singing. "Oh, thank you, Virgil." Virgil stepped back from the counter. "So, do you need help, or do you want to help?" "If you need help, I can." Janus shrugged. "Well, if you want to dry the dishes, go ahead. The towels are in that drawer." He pointed with one gloved hand to a small drawer in the counter. Virgil opened it and grabbed a dish towel. He waited as Mr. Chimera peeled off his fabric gloves and grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from where they sat on the island. Virgil hadn't seen the guy without his gloves at all. It made Virgil curious as to why he wore them all the time. "Why do you wear gloves?" Virgil blurted. A moment later, it occurred to him that such an abrupt question might be rude, and he found himself regretting saying anything. Janus didn't seem bothered by it, however. "I don't like things touching my hands," he said, tugging the rubber gloves on. "Especially not water. I hate the feeling of my hands being wet." Virgil nodded in understanding. "I don't like water much either," he admitted. "I mean, I can get wet, but being submerged isn't fun." A small smile twitched across Janus's mouth. "Well, I suppose we have a bit more in common than I originally thought." Virgil felt a small bit of relief wash over him. Janus didn't seem to hate him. Virgil still didn't trust the guy 100%, but he seemed to understand Virgil a little bit. Janus stuck his hands in the sink and started scrubbing the dishes. The two of them worked in silence, the jazzy music from Janus's phone the only sound between them. Janus put the clean dishes in the sink next to his, and Virgil grabbed them and dried them off. The silence was comfortable, which was a surprise to Virgil. He always felt obligated to talk when he was around others, but Janus seemed perfectly content to stay quiet. The pile of dishes dwindled as they worked. The only conversation they made was when Virgil was asking Janus where the clean dishes were supposed to be put away. However, they had almost finished when Janus decided to finally speak. "Virgil," he said, "I have a question." Virgil furrowed his brow as he dried off the frying pan they'd used to make pancakes. "Yeah?" "You aren't Patton Hart's biological children." "That's a statement, not a question," Virgil pointed out. "Yes, I just wanted to make sure." Janus set a plate in the sink in front of Virgil. "My question is, how did you and your brothers end up with Patton for a father?" Virgil wasn't exactly sure how to answer. He didn't want to pour out his whole life story, but what could he say? "Well," he began, "we were homeless for a while. I was 13 and the twins were 9, so I tried to take care of them. We were on the streets for maybe 4 months. It was difficult, but we managed. At one point, we hid under someone's porch during a storm, since we didn't have any actual shelter, and the owner of the house found us in the morning and woke us up. He let us stay, and..." Virgil shrugged. "We've been living with Patton ever since." "So he didn't legally adopt you?" Janus snorted. "Of course, I can't remember a time he ever did something within the lines of the law." Virgil was taken aback by that. "What do you mean?" Janus was silent as he scrubbed the syrup off a butter knife. "I'm sure you're aware of the nature of my business at this point, correct?" "Yeah, but what does that have to do with Dad?" Janus took a deep breath. "Your father used to be involved in the same sort of things I am. I never worked with him personally. In fact, the man was quite a nuisance to Chimera. The second I would try to do anything, he would swoop in, guns blazing. Patton was a very, very skilled hitman." "He was an assassin?" Virgil breathed. "That's so cool!" The information should have been terrifying, but that sounded so awesome to Virgil. So many books he'd read and movies he'd watched had badass characters who were assassins. He had a small collection of DC comics at home, specifically ones that featured any appearance of Deadshot. He'd watched that Suicide Squad movie for 5 nights in a row when it first came out, just so he could watch the parts with that same character. Janus nodded. "Well, yes, I suppose it is kind of cool. Until you're the one on the receiving end of a sniper rifle." Virgil's excitement wilted. Oh, he hadn't thought of that. "But don't let my experience with your father discourage your excitement," Janus added, as if he knew that Virgil's feelings were turning into disappointment. "Patton Hart was the most skilled hitman I have ever seen. It takes so much talent to do that kind of job. He was level-headed, absolutely brilliant, and I can't even imagine how much physical skill it would have taken to succeed as an assassin. Patton has never missed a shot to my knowledge, not until I became his target 10 years ago." Virgil perked up. That sounded interesting. "What happened?" "It is quite a long story, and unfortunately..." Janus placed the last plate in Virgil's sink. "We are now done with the dishes." He pulled the plug out of his sink and then took off his gloves. "Perhaps I can tell you some other time." Virgil's spirits sank as Janus picked up his phone and fabric gloves. "How about tomorrow?" Virgil suggested. Janus paused just before he was about to head for the door. Virgil steeled his nerves. "We can make supper again tomorrow, and you can tell me about Dad then." Janus blinked. Then he smiled. "That sounds good to me." Virgil flopped down in his bed later that night, heaving a great sigh. Today had been an especially exhausting day, probably one of the worst days he'd had in a while. He had a panic attack and a shutdown just that morning, and he still found it hard to adjust to the fact that Dad wasn't here. However, it still wasn't as bad as yesterday. At least there were a few decent things that happened today.
He found out Dad was still alive, for one, and Mr. Minder was here now. There was someone in the house he could trust. Virgil kept his eyes narrowed through the bright lights in his room. Tomorrow morning, the first thing Virgil would do is ask Janus for dimmer lights, preferably purple ones if they had any. Virgil grabbed his backpack and dragged it across the bed towards him. He hadn't really unpacked anything yet. He didn't want to. Unpacking meant making a commitment to staying here. He opted to leave most of his stuff in the bag. For now, the most he would commit to was washing his clothes here when he needed to. That and sleeping. This was a temporary home, nothing more. However, he dug his Draculaura doll out of his bag with her stand and gently set her on the nightstand. He placed her little plastic brush next to her. She could watch over him while he slept, make sure nothing bad happened in the middle of the night. He sat up when he heard someone knock quietly on the door. "Who is it?" The door opened to reveal Roman in his red and green pajamas. The shirt would have been red to match his pants, but he and Remus had traded shirts when Dad had first bought them for the twins. "Where's Remus?" Virgil asked. "Mr. Minder's helping him check the locks," Roman said. His gaze was cast to the floor, and he scuffed his socked feet on the carpet as if he was nervous. "You okay, Ro?" Roman looked up and wiped at his eyes. Tears streamed down his face. "I miss Dad." He managed to splutter through his tears. Virgil's heart clenched with sympathy. "Oh, come here, kiddo," he said, holding his arms out. Roman choked out a sob at the nickname and rushed forward. He collided with Virgil, almost causing the two of them to fall over on the bed. Roman clung to Virgil and cried into his sweater as Virgil wrapped his arms around his little brother. Virgil felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't even considered how badly Roman and Remus might have been taking this whole situation. Of course Roman would miss Dad. Roman was one of the most emotional people Virgil knew. Roman curled up on Virgil's bed, sniffling and sobbing. Virgil hugged him close. He hated that this situation had interrupted Roman's life. He was the only one out of the three of them who had even gotten a chance to have a somewhat normal childhood. Sure, he was on the run with them for 4 months before Patton found them, but the kid was never berated as a bad child in foster homes just for the way he functioned. He was able to have a better childhood than the other two. Virgil hated that something was interrupting that for him. Footsteps approached the door. It swung open. Remus poked his head into the room, staring at the two of them with concern. Virgil let go of Roman with one arm so he could gesture for Remus to join them. He shuffled across the carpet and crawled onto the bed next to Roman. He cuddled up next to his twin. If not for the bleached streak in Remus's hair, a stranger would have looked at the two of them and found them indistinguishable from each other. However, looking at Remus, Virgil saw a weariness in his eyes that could have rivaled that as a veteran. The twins weren't interchangeable. Remus carried too much emotional and mental baggage. Roman carried some, but didn't know how to not buckle under the weight of it. Virgil and Remus both embraced Roman as he sobbed into Virgil's sweater. The two of them exchanged a concerned glance. Roman crying wasn't exactly uncommon, but he didn't often start sobbing to this capacity. Dad's absence must have really taken a toll on him. It was taking a toll on all three of them. Virgil reached around Roman to wrap an arm around Remus's shoulders. The three of them sat there as Roman cried. His tears were surely soaking through one of the patches on Virgil's sweater, but he didn't mind. Slowly, Roman's sobbing dissolved into teary hiccups, which eventually fell away to silence. His breathing evened out, and Virgil gently lifted Roman's head a little to see that his eyes were closed. His cheeks were stained with tear tracks. Virgil covered one hand with his sweater sleeve to wipe them off his face. Virgil glanced up at Remus. His eyes were half shut. He stifled a yawn behind the back of his hand. "Can we stay here tonight?" he whispered. Virgil nodded. Remus left Roman and crawled across the bed to cuddle into Virgil's other side, being very careful so as to not wake his twin. He nuzzled into Virgil's hoodie and shut his eyes. Virgil gently laid back on his bed, his brothers in his arms. Roman grunted at the movement, but he didn't wake. Virgil managed to grab a blanket and pull it on over the three of them. It had been so long since the three of them had spent some brotherly time together like this, as a family. The only thing they were missing was Dad. It took over an hour for Remy to finally move from his spot hunched over the toilet. He sat up with a pained groan, and Patton handed him the water bottle Andy had left. Remy chugged it like a dehydrated man stuck in the desert. He hadn't really thrown up at all over the past half hour, but every time he moved, he said he still felt nauseous, so he and Patton had remained in the bathroom. Remy lowered the mostly empty water bottle and took a deep breath. Patton held up the shirt Andy had brought him. "You want to change into something less sweaty?" Remy nodded slowly. He tugged on his shirt, trying to take it off. He managed well enough, though Patton had to help him get it over his head. Patton assisted him into the new shirt. It was a long-sleeved black shirt that Patton had forgot he'd shoved into his backpack. A graphic print of a cartoon cat was plastered on the front of it. The sleeves half covered Remy's hands, and the collar was a little loose on his shoulders.
Seeing Remy in one of Patton's shirts made him realize that Remy was actually quite a bit smaller than Patton. It was easy to forget about when Remy's presence was so loud and large. Remy put his hands on the ground and tried to push himself to his feet. Patton lunged forward and caught him just as Remy almost toppled over. "I'm fine," Remy slurred, but he gripped Patton's shoulders to keep himself upright anyway. Patton wrapped an arm around Remy's waist and shuffled out of the bathroom with him. Thomas was already curled up in a bundle of blankets on the floor, eyes closed. Andy was focused on her laptop screen, and Price was staring at the TV. At least she had the decency to turn off the audio and replace it with subtitles so she wouldn't wake Thomas. They must have shoved the leftover pizza into the mini fridge. Patton guided Remy over to sit on the bed that wasn't occupied by anyone. "You need help with anything else?" Remy shook his head and waved Patton away. "I got it." He unbuttoned his jeans and started trying to wriggle his way out of them. As Remy struggled with his pants, Patton grabbed his pajamas and went into the bathroom to change. He was a bit worried about Remy. Drugs were dangerous. It was totally possible that he'd been given too much. Patton left the bathroom to see Remy sprawled face down on the bed in just his boxers and Patton's shirt. His jeans were tossed on top of his leather jacket, and he'd managed to take off his Doc Martens as well. They were thrown haphazardly onto the floor next to Patton's bag. Patton stepped over his bag. "Get under the covers, Rem," he said, taking off his glasses and settling them on the nightstand. "We're going to sleep." Remy grumbled something under his breath, but he managed to roll over and tug the covers back. He crawled under the blankets and curled up in a ball. Seeing Remy like this, without his usual sass and sarcasm, made him seem so much smaller. It was odd to see him so quiet. Patton couldn't even imagine how Remy was feeling. Patton lied down in bed and pulled the covers over him. "Let me know if you need anything, Rem." Remy rolled over so he was pressed into Patton's side. He rested his head on Patton's chest. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Patton furrowed his brow as he wrapped his arms around Remy. "What for?" "I'm supposed to protect you," Remy said. "I just got us into trouble." Patton shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong," he reassured him. "Everything's fine. Let's go to sleep now, okay? You need some rest." Remy nodded slowly. "Okay." He shut his eyes. Patton stared up at the ceiling as Remy drifted off to sleep. There was a click as Price turned off the lamp on the nightstand. Blankets rustled as she and Andy crawled into their own bed and turned in for the night. Long after the two of them started snoring away, Patton was still awake. He wished more than anything that they were back home. Remy wouldn't have ended up here like this if they'd stayed, but they were stuck here instead, and Patton's family was stuck back in Clonmore. Granted, he considered Remy part of his family, and he was here. While Patton wished Remy could have stayed behind and stayed safe, he was infinitely relieved that he had Remy with him. He had no idea what he would have done without Remy. But Patton still missed his kiddos. A heavy feeling of loneliness settled down his chest as he thought about how Virgil, Roman, and Remus were doing. He knew his kiddos missed him terribly, but he was willing to bet that he missed them even more. He'd gotten used to having these kids around him over the past couple years. It felt strange going to bed without watching a Disney movie with Roman and Remus, and struggling to get them to calm down enough to go to sleep, or listening to Virgil rant about his latest special interest before carrying him downstairs to bed when he inevitably got tired and nearly fell asleep on the couch. A lump formed in Patton's throat. Tears sprang to his eyes and he quickly wiped them away. He wasn't going to cry. He didn't want to risk waking up anyone else. He took a shaky breath and shut his eyes. Things would be better tomorrow. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. If you like what you hear and you want to read more, you can find the link to the fic and the author in the description. If you want to check out other podfics I've done, you can click on the playlist linked on the screen. See you next time!